Hello, I'm Tori Camp with the National Center for Victims of Crime. Thank you for joining this webinar today called Victim Notification and Sexual Assault Cases with Unprocessed Kits. A note about today's webinar, it is a re-recording of the original webinar due to technology issues that made the original recording unusual. Therefore, while 4 presenters originally presented this webinar and all the original slides are included here today, Debbie Kane will be presenting this recorded version. Thank you for your understanding. The National Center for Victims of Crime is a 25-year-old national resource and advocacy organization that works to help victims of all types of crime rebuild their lives. We do this through advocacy for victims' rights and funding for services and training and technical assistance to those who work with survivors. Under this grant, we are providing training such as this webinar, technical assistance, for example, with creating a victim notification protocol, and creating an online resource collection that includes policies and protocols regarding victim notification and other aspects of working with victims in untested sexual assault cases. We are also obtaining perspectives from victims. In 2012, we held a roundtable with survivors whose kits had been untested for many years. We learned a great deal from these survivors about what worked for them and what didn't in these cases. A brief report is available on our website. We have loads of other information about the use of DNA in the criminal justice system, so check it out at victimsofcrime.org/DNA. All of our webinars are archived online. We are grateful to be funded by the Office on Violence Against Women to help communities create a victim-sensitive approach to the sexual assault kit backlog reduction. Okay, on to our speaker. Debbie Kane is the Executive Director to the Michigan Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Prevention and Treatment Board. Ms. Kane spent the first 15 years of her career as the founding Executive Director of Haven, a large suburban sexual assault and domestic violence program. Debbie then spent 4 years as the Director of the Sexual Assault Prevention and Awareness Center at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Debbie has served as a consultant, author, and editor for a number of articles, manuals, and publications related to violence against women and children. She has been involved in developing training curriculum for judges, police, Children's Protective Services staff, friend of the court, prosecutors, welfare workers, domestic violence, and sexual assault program staff. Thank you so much, Debbie, and I'm going to hand this over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tori. Well, I'm delighted to be here to replicate this important work that we had the opportunity to do in Michigan related specifically to Detroit. I do want to give special kudos to my original presenters and members of our team. Lori Rogers, who's a longtime advocate in domestic and sexual violence and a staff attorney in our agency, was the person who worked very closely on the guiding principles that we're going to talk about. Herb Tanner was the person who did the investigation and prosecution end of things from the Prosecuting Attorneys Association of Michigan. And Kimberly Hurst is the Executive Director of Wayne County SAFE, which is an advocacy and SANE program in Detroit and Wayne County, Michigan. So what you'll see today are slides that represent the work that the 4 of us and several others did specifically as related to the kits in Detroit. So let me tell you just a minute about the 400 project, which is what we're overviewing today. The 400 project came about when in late 2009, Prosecutor Kim Worthy became aware that there were over 10,000 sexual assault kits that had been found in the city of Detroit police property room and in an old crime lab and several other locations. And needless to say, Prosecutor Worthy was both very surprised and distressed to find that there were a number of sexual assault kits sitting on shelves and boxes and barrels and all kinds of places scattered across the city of Detroit. And I do want to give a shout out to Prosecutor Kim Worthy. She's been the amazing catalyst of making all the work that's happened to date happen in this particular arena, and we're very grateful to her for contacting our board and saying, I need help. We need to know how to deal with the fact that we've got all of these kits, mostly untested kits, sitting here and that they go back, we're not sure how far at that point in time. And so she brought us into the work. And what we did was work with our state partners from the Michigan State Police, who were picking up the crime lab responsibilities for this. The Detroit Police Department's crime lab had previously been responsible for kits in the city, but they had since closed. So the state police were going to have to step in. And we met with the Prosecuting Attorneys Association of Michigan and a number of our state partners to look at what was the scope of the work that we were looking at and what was the cost of that going to be to the state as they began to prepare for the reality of all of these untested kits. And the timing was incredibly fortuitous, and I can't thank enough the Office on Violence Against Women for stepping in and allowing us to use our board as the state stop administering agency, and OVW was very supportive of letting us use some of our stop stimulus or ARA dollars to actually put this project together. And so I do want to give them their kudos as well. What you can see then is that the goals of the 400 project really pertain to actually pulling 400 kits. We knew originally that there were 10,500 and some kits there. Ultimately, time indicated that there were about 11,000 plus kits that were sitting there. We didn't know what time frames they represented. We didn't know if all of them indeed were kits and whether they'd all been tested or untested. And so we had a statistician from Michigan State University who came in, and he actually looked at the number of kits that were that we were aware of at that time, over 10,500 of them. And what he determined was that if we randomly selected 400 of those kits, that they would give us a solid representative sample of what we were dealing with. So that's how we arrived at the 400 project, is that he then worked with us to randomly select 400 kits that we would look at. The goal was to send those kits in for testing so that we could determine what the results were. We tracked very carefully whether the kits had ever been opened. We did find in some cases that the kits had been tested in just a handful of them, and they'd been put back in the property room in case there was any further appeal or adjudication. The vast majority of kits had not been tested and had never been opened. They were simply sitting on shelves someplace. The second thing that we wanted to do with the 400 project was to, in addition to testing all of those kits, we wanted to look at each one of those cases and try to look at whether it was still possible to go in and recommend prosecution to Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy. So we did look at the files on every single one of those kits and every piece of information that we could find to make a determination about statute of limitation issues, because in Michigan it was in the early 2000s that we got rid of a statute of limitation, but we ultimately found that these kits went back as far as 30 years. And so in some of those cases, there were issues depending on, other crimes that were committed in the context of the sexual assault. It was really important to us. We began talking to other cities and communities across the country, Los Angeles, New York, Dallas, Houston, various communities where we knew there had also been large numbers of untested kits sitting on shelves. And so we really wanted to try to find out and learn from their experience as much as we could. And one of the things that we noted is that our board is a very advocacy-oriented group, and although we work with very closely all of the disciplines who are dealing with sexual assault, the reality is it's important to us that victim advocacy always be represented because of the important view that they bring, but also the incredible wealth of resources that they bring for survivors and providing services and support for survivors. So one of the things we knew right up front was that in setting up this process, we wanted to ensure that we had the criminal justice system in place, but that we also had victim advocates at the table, and we were looking at resources and services that could be provided. And the fourth goal that we had was to We were so fortunate that, so many of the cities that I just mentioned, or places like Phoenix, were wonderful to us in teaching us the lessons that they had learned as they had been ahead of us in dealing with this. And we wanted to be very careful in recording and sharing, as we are today, some of the lessons we learned, for good and for bad. There were things we tried that clearly didn't work. And we wanted to be able to share both the things we thought had worked, the areas we continue to grapple with, and the areas where we also had made mistakes, so that we could hopefully help others in avoiding those mistakes. The process that we used began with team building, and that seems pretty basic, but the reality was the 400 project team consisted of 2 people from the Prosecuting Attorneys Association who brought the eyes of prosecutors to the table. Although neither of them were prosecutors in Wayne County, they were people who were former prosecutors and actually looked at the information in a way that they were thinking with the eyes of a prosecutor taking the case on. Prosecuting Attorneys Association was also able to hire a former homicide detective who had since retired, and we provided extensive training to her and all the members of the team on all of the issues of sexual assault that we knew were important. And that person then was the detective who actually went out and looked at the information from the police vantage point. I mentioned earlier Kim Hurst, who is with Wayne County SAFE. Kim is by profession a physician's assistant who established a SANE program in Wayne County, Michigan, and also with our assistance was able to actually hire several advocates for this process. So we had both that SANE set of eyes on things as well as bringing in advocates who are going to be working on these specific cases. And then finally, our board is mostly people like myself who come from the sexual assault and victim advocacy world. Some of us have different training. Lori, as I mentioned, is actually an attorney by profession, but has spent most of her years and her career in nonprofit victim service agencies. And so we tried to look at things to see what the state could learn from this and what were trends and patterns that would go far beyond what we were looking at in Detroit or Wayne County. So with all of that said, we, needless to say, needed to do some team building. These were people who hadn't worked together before. Some of them came in with other backgrounds like homicide versus sexual assault. We came in from different professions. We were people who hadn't necessarily known one another or worked together, and we did spend a fair amount of time in the beginning doing some team building. And Lori Rogers, who I mentioned from our staff, is tremendous at doing that kind of thing, and we actually took advantage of some of her skills. We found that very quickly one of the things that we needed to do was be cognizant of reflecting the different vantage points of our various professions, that we were multidisciplinary in nature, and that we had a very big task to do in a very limited period of time, and that we knew that it wasn't going to be an easy task to take on. So with that in mind, we began looking at the importance of a mission statement and guiding principles that would be our centering points as we went forward. You can see on this slide what our mission statement was, and I know it sounds simplistic when you do a mission statement. I can't tell you how many times over the course of the year plus that we worked on the actual cases and we worked on the process for those cases that we kept coming back to this mission statement. We literally had these done up on big wall boards, and at every meeting, when we were meeting once a week, we had those around the room. And occasionally when we'd be in vociferous discussions about the pros and cons of various things and trying to accomplish from our various vantage points what we thought was important, there were many times that Lori, as our facilitator, brought us back to, okay, we've got several ideas on the table. What reflects the mission statement that we as a group have? And so taking the time to do that, and it was about a good day's work for us that we set aside a day in the early stages to do this. That mission statement and these guiding principles were incredibly important. As you'll see on this particular slide, guiding principle number 1, which again I'm not going to read to you, these were guiding principles that we had complete unanimity in saying this is what we're all agreeing to. We're going to operate as a group with these principles in mind. And what we were able to do then is continually come back to these and say, are we acting in a victim-centered way? Are we taking into account victim safety? And so you can see in guiding principle 1 and also guiding principle 2, which was helpful because sometimes we did have very strong opinions. None of us were shy people for the most part. And it was a good reminder that we needed to be honest with each other. We needed to be open to learning from one another, but we must always, we must always be demonstrating mutual respect, and that there's nothing wrong with having a different vantage point or goal. Many people go into law enforcement or prosecution because they want to take bad people off the streets and they want to protect the community at large. And as advocates, often we're looking at one particular person and the best interest of that person at that moment in time. And so to be able to accept the difference in those roles but do it in a respectful way that both have an important place in all of this was something that we tried to demonstrate and call each other out on and refer back to guiding principle 2 whenever we needed to. Guiding principle 3, again, is sometimes a hard one depending on what our personal vantage point is and what our professional vantage point might be, in that there were those of us on the group who advocated very strongly about listening to victims and survivors' choices, and that sometimes we might not agree with the choice that they wanted to make, or we felt it put them in an unsafe position. There were those of us in the group who felt that we were doing a disjustice to the community at large to know that we had somebody who was continuing to assault others out there, and that this was a person whose testimony or participation in the criminal justice process was needed for the greater purposes of community safety. We looked at all of those things, and again, we continued to come back to and said, in the end, it's okay that we disagree, but we really have to look at, the needs and the autonomy and decision-making of individual victims. In guiding principles 4 and 5, you can see that we really tried to honor that the focus of the investigation was on the offender, the David Lee Sachs stuff, which is always so amazing. And as I said, we spent a lot of time putting team members through training. We brought amazing national presenters in or sent people in teams to training and such to ensure that we really were using that victim-centered and offender-focused kind of approach. And that was pretty new and unique for some of the people who were working in this, who had been much more oriented to concerns about whether the victim was telling the truth and those kinds of things. So that was an important issue for us to deal with as well. And that we really wanted to not just be doing the same old, but that we wanted to be doing cutting edge, outside the box, best practice work. And that meant that we knew we were on the edge a little bit, and that meant we would make mistakes, but we would do it with as much integrity as we could, and that we were willing to try to be more cutting edge in the work that we were actually doing. So when we talk about victim notification, I specifically want to give our thanks to Dr. Rebecca Campbell, who's just down the street from us at Michigan State University, and her research and her generosity of time in helping us think through, especially the neurobiology of trauma and thinking about what it meant to go into somebody, not just a year or two, which is hard enough, but in some of these cases, 8, 10, 12, 15 years later, when they hadn't heard from anybody for years, and to suddenly open the door and have them be in a very different place in their life, and suddenly we're bringing something back up for them. So on victim notification, we spent a lot of time talking to other communities who had done this, talking to Dr. Campbell and other people to try to think about what was the best and most responsible way. What I do want to let people know is that of the 400 kits that we had, we tested all 400 of them. 252 of those, or 63% of them, actually had enough DNA that we were able, the state lab was actually able to enter them into CODIS. So 252 of those kits, we had what was needed to enter them into CODIS. And of those 252 that went into CODIS, on 87 of them, and this was as of the end of the project, that's continued to grow over time, 87 of those 252 resulted in identifications. So 35% we actually got identification and were able to know who the perp was in many of those cases. And I do want to say, since this is a re-recording, that since that time we continue to have new CODIS hits come in all the time. So that number of 87 is a dated number, and I don't have the current number, but it continues to grow. We constantly are getting new hits that come in. So our victim notification process, and what we meant by that was that the people we would be contacting were people where we had a CODIS hit, for a lot of different reasons, some of them very pragmatic, like we had short periods of time to do this work and we had a very narrow scope in the purposes of the work and very limited bodies to do the work. We made a very pragmatic decision that we would not contact all 400 of the people whose lives those kits represented, but that we would only contact the victims where we actually got a CODIS hit and we had new information that we could provide to them as the result of that. So that's what we meant by victim notification for the purposes of this particular project only. In looking at the victim notification, we spent a lot of time and a lot of discussion and research on what was the best way to do that. You know, how do you suddenly knock on somebody's door? How do you suddenly say, hey, it's 8 years later and you haven't heard from anybody, but we now have an identification of who your rapist is and whether he's done this or other crimes before, and maybe even an address on where he lives. And so we spent a lot of time working and trying to come up with a magic formula to do that. And what I will say to you is that in our particular case, we've made a number of strides in the 2.5 or 3 years since then. But for the purposes of this project, what we determined was that we had the luxury of doing it case by case to a large degree, and that we made a lot of those decisions as a group, the 400 project team. We would review the circumstances of the case and what we knew and didn't, and we had the luxury of being able to a large extent to make it unique in how that approach was made based on what the person's particular circumstances were. The first step, of course, was locating the victim, and again, remembering we had cases that went back almost 30 years. That was not as easy as it sounds, and what we did find, I as a 30-some-year victim advocate will tell you that I've spent a lot of years in sexual assault cases, but one of the things that was incredibly different and not in my particular experience repertoire was the difference with cold cases. Not surprisingly, a substantial number of the victims that we had been teenagers and very young adults at the time of the assault. And so now they were adults, and their name may be different. They might not live in the area. They may be in a relationship with somebody. They might have children. You know, there were so many different things that were complicated in trying to track down, you know, doctors, and Detroit has a couple of training facilities for medical schools, and so some of the people who'd actually done the kits at those times were people who had finished medical school and moved to various parts of the country. There were just so many things that made it difficult and took tons of time on the part of the investigator to actually be able to track down the victims in the cases we were talking about. On the initial contact with victims, what we looked at was that the investigator would make the first contact in person, but that the investigator would take with her a letter talking a little bit about our services, and we had an advocate who was on call, who was available to talk to the victim at that point if she wanted to do that. There were a lot of reasons that we had for not taking an advocate to the scene most of the time. There were a lot of reasons that we decided it needed to be the investigator who did that. Some of them were very specific to the project we were doing because these were cold cases, and we did not want to in any way screw up the possibility that this was a case that might go to trial. Part of it was the pragmatics, again, of having limited people and access, and that, you know, there were just a lot of reasons we did that, and we'd be happy to share any of that in more detail with people who might find it helpful. In many of the cases, the advocate was able to literally get on the phone with the victim at that point in time, or the investigator could say, the advocate could see you tomorrow at 10. You know, we obviously left that to the choice and discretion of each individual victim, but we tried to provide that hookup with the victim and an advocate, if the victim so chose, as immediately as we could. That initial contact did provide information about, you know, where we were, and we spent a lot of time talking about, you know, how do you just knock on somebody's door and say, hey, you made a police report, you got a kit done, and you've been sitting here for 8 years and nobody's called you back in that time in many of these cases. So we tried to tell them a little bit about the fact that, you know, how this had come about and those kinds of things. And we were walking a fine line on when do you give that information. And again, we spent a lot of time with Becky Campbell talking about, you know, you've now potentially re-traumatized the person, you've put them in a position that, you know, they're not thinking along those lines. Suddenly there's a police officer at their door, and they don't know why or what it's about. And so, again, we really tried to be as individual as we possibly could in looking at those cases and to do the best job that we could in providing opportunities for people to really think about the information and not overwhelm and inundate them. And I have to say, as a longtime advocate, you know, in my very early days in the late 1970s, we went in with big packets of information and started talking immediately, and you know, it was a very different kind of mindset, trying to think about what people are ready to hear and do that in stages and via a process. So in looking at how did victims respond to the investigator, not at all surprisingly, the responses were all over the place. People who were deeply grateful to hear from someone, people who were angry, and every possible emotional response Deborah, the investigator, encountered and experienced. And we did find that, again, not surprisingly, the responses sometimes changed over time. Somebody who was very angry at the moment might call back a week or months later and say, I've had time to think about this and absorb it, and I decided I do want to go forward in looking at the case. So we continued to ensure and make certain that victim advocates were available both immediately and long-term, because we did not want to open up this whole issue in people's lives and not have the resources for advocates and counselors to be available to actually work with them. And so that was a really key part of how we designed this project and where we put money and funding. The advocates in the 400 project did have contact with a significant number of the victims, and those contacts were very different and changed and were very unique over time as they continued to deal with victims. For instance, after the notification, some of them didn't want anything to do with law enforcement at all. But they did need help with other issues like counseling, or they weren't interested in that. One of the things I think is really important to note is that we were dealing with an urban community and a city where almost 90% of the population is African American, and a community which is now not only bankrupt, but the poverty rate in the city of Detroit is extraordinarily high. So when we looked at the advocacy, part of what we really tried to design and develop was that we were coming in about a sexual assault that may have happened years ago, but the reality is we were walking into situations where women were concerned about being evicted from their home because they'd lost their job. Some women had their children in temporary foster care, and their their immediate issue was trying to get their children back. So there were a lot of issues that, in essence, women were saying, I don't have the luxury of thinking about this assault that happened to me a long time ago. I've got much more immediate issues. She might be in a violent interpersonal relationship at this point in time. So we really tried to look at all of those things and make those kinds of resources available. As you can see on this particular slide, there were a lot of different ways that victims responded. In some cases, we saw a larger than average, what the national statistics would show, number of cases where it was a stranger assault, and by stranger it meant she couldn't identify him by name or address or something like that. She might know a nickname or a street name, but all of those things about what her relationship had been and how old she was, all the things that you would expect, the advocates actually, as they continued to work with victims, heard all of those different things. And as you would expect, many of them were very angry and disappointed by the fact that they hadn't been taken seriously and that nothing had happened with their case. And sadly, to me, a huge number of them expressed during this project and since this project sort of a recognition and a resignation that they weren't surprised, that they sort of didn't expect that anybody would do anything. And I think that's an awful commentary, but one that we definitely saw. So in this one, what you'll see is that for some people, our contacts with them actually created, a greater sense of mistrust toward the system. For some, it opened the door in feeling like, I don't believe in what you're doing. I'm angry that I was never apologized to. I'm angry that nobody came to see me. But they were open to taking advantage of resources and that kind of thing. It was a wide range, as we would expect from any group of survivors. Additional considerations that we wanted to mention had to do with how victims were going to respond in asking, why did this happen? And again, our role in the 400 Project was not really to go down that road. Our role was to say, it's come to Prosecutor Worthy's attention. She has now authorized that we can go forward and with these cases, at least in testing them and such. But you can imagine if somebody knocked on your door today, how that would feel, and why isn't I haven't heard from anybody, and what's in my police report, and do you know who the suspect is, and can you tell me who he is, and can I see my police report, and all of those kinds of things. And to be honest, when you're dealing with kits that have been shelved and untested, the reality is, having looked at all of those police reports, some of them didn't have information that would feel very good to a victim to see. So we talked a lot about what do we do when people ask for that, and of course our perspective was that they have a right to any information in their files and such, but the truth was some of the things that were written about victims in those reports were a clear indication of why the case hadn't been pursued. In looking at the statistical analysis, this was a big piece of what we were trying to do. And again, in addition to pursuing the individual cases where we did have CODIS hits, part of what we were trying to do was look at what statistically, what did this report tell us about at the time, the 10,559 other kits that were still sitting there waiting for testing. And so we developed a process that we had various stopping points, and I'm not going to spend much time on this. Our prosecutor, Herb Tanner from the Prosecuting Attorneys Association of Michigan, was stellar in working with the people at the Michigan State Police Laboratory on actually looking at the various stages that we could stop evidence and look at statistically what it meant. And so in our analysis, what we tried to do was predict what these 10,559 kits would look like and what they would represent, and how many would stop at each of those stages so that the State Police Department, the prosecutor's office, investigators could look at if it stops here, we've got DNA, but we don't yet have a CODIS hit, what does that mean? Versus we got a CODIS hit, or we have no DNA at all, but there may be other evidence back there, like sheets or other things that aren't part of the kit itself. So we did actually try to break those stages down and look at each of those potential areas statistically. So the statistical analysis was basically that out of the total, going back to what I mentioned to you earlier, that we would have expected, the statistician, Dr. Stephen Pierce, believed that based on what we saw in the 400, that 4,250 of those kits would contain biological evidence that could be tested for DNA. And of those 4,250, that 3,669 of them would have enough DNA and meet all of the conditions that you have to meet in a profile for actual entry into the CODIS system. And that once they were in the CODIS system, the 3,669, that 1,249 of those would match on DNA profiles. And that 132 of those would be a forensic association, and 1,109 would be associated with an identified person. So an extraordinarily large percentage, far larger than what we were hearing from other communities at that point, of odds that we'd actually have the DNA in those kits to be able to identify who the perpetrator was. So we were both dismayed and excited to some extent by the potential for some of the victims who did wish to go forward with the case to actually be able to say, we can identify who the person is for you. Here are a few of the outcomes, and again, this represents a bit of lag time. At the point that we did the original webinar, 2 cases had been prosecuted. One of them resulted in a conviction and one resulted in a plea, a guilty plea. We've since had several more of those. I think we've had closer to a dozen that have gone forward, and all of them successfully. So again, kudos to the Wayne County prosecutor, Kim Worthy, and her staff for really taking these cases forward and not just getting the information saying, hey, we've got a CODIS hit, but we're not going to do anything with it. When they've had it and when the victim said, I want justice, and justice to me means I want you to go forward on this case, they've been aggressive in doing that. So that gives you a very quick overview of what we did with the 400 project. Since then, we were very lucky that the National Institute of Justice, with Dr. Rebecca Campbell as the researcher on that, worked with the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office and others of us to take the project further, but the 400 project really was a stepping stone and a tremendous opportunity for learning for us. We certainly don't have all the answers, but what I hope we've been able to do today is share with you a little bit of how we set it up and what we learned from the process. Statistically, as we've gone forward, the statistician has been dead on in actually what he anticipated we would see. The numbers are staggeringly close. And in conclusion, I do want to thank the Office on Violence Against Women because they were absolutely stellar in supporting us in doing this work, and we're very proud of the work that we've done. So if anyone wants to get in touch with me, you can see my name and contact information, and we appreciate the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the 400 project.
Thank you so much, Debbie. This is Tori again. The 400 project was a groundbreaking project providing rich information for the field. We appreciate you outlining the project and sharing your experiences and lessons learned. Thank you for those who are listening as well. If you like this webinar, more are available at victimsofcrime.org/DNA. Thank you very much.
So we good, Tori?